Norwich City concluded their championship campaign with some of the greatest hits from 2024-25. Some brilliant attacking, plenty of Carrow Road goals, but also some pretty questionable defending as well. There were farewells. It was an emotional day at Carrow Road as obviously Norwich City concluded their 46-game campaign, a 13th place finish. We're going to dissect all of that and more. Welcome to this week's edition of the PinkUn.com at Norwich City podcast, brought to you in association with First Bus. I'm Connor Southwell, joined by Seaman, Paddy Davitt and Adam Harvey. Paddy, I mean, as a game of football, because we're going to talk about so much, so let's get the game out of the way. Did we learn anything new about Norwich City, or maybe even Jack Wilshere's Norwich City today that perhaps we didn't already know?
No, I don't think so, no. Does Ball Science know where the goal is? Can Nunes hit a free kick? No.
Can Norwich defend?
No, irrespective of how many players they face in the opposition ranks. And I've seen a few on social make that point. You know, there was one tweet I did see since the final was almost if you'd removed Jack, put Johannes back in there, and seen that type of performance, and is that dissimilar? Probably not in many aspects. But to be fair, you know, they've finished on a winning note. They did. I don't think as a performance, if you bookend that with what we saw at Middlesbrough, I don't think it felt as controlled and composed in terms of Wilshere's imprint. But it was just a bit of a mad afternoon all round. You know, there were so many elements to that day, far beyond just the 90 minutes. And then the way that first half unfolded, it was just like a runaway train type of a game. So very difficult to, I think, extrapolate any definitive sense of what Wilshere's impact would be moving forward, which we'll get into in due course. But you know, as an exercise, I think Norwich fans, will they go home happy today that they've seen their team win, score plenty of goals, and got to say a proper farewell to 3 players and maybe more if the transfer window goes in a different certain direction over the summer? Then I think the answer is yes, and that very much was a step forward from the last Carrow Road affair, which was, if we need reminding, Portsmouth on Good Friday. So at least it's finishing on a positive note. And I think there's a few who would take that after certainly the last 16, 17 games of this season, which were feeling like they were just on an endless downward spiral and ultimately cost Johannes' job.
Yeah, and a winning note as well, which after what we've seen, what was it, 1 win in 10 and whatnot, and obviously we'll get into Wilshere, but to take 4 points from 2 games, point on the road, win at Carrow Road, I'd say that's a pretty decent return over 2 games. Sam, it was your birthday this week, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll talk about football in a moment. What flavour cake did you have?
It was white chocolate and raspberry.
Very nice.
Yeah,
Sophisticated.
Yeah, I was quite happy with that. I feel like you have enough, you know, buttercream and chocolate and that over your years. So it was a good shout. To be fair, it was I liked it a lot.
Good stuff. Did you have a good day, all told?
It was very good. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Good. Right, we've covered that now. Football.
Probably did more content on that than the actual game.
yeah. But I mean, the game in itself, as we mentioned, there was some. And I'll let you take the attacking stuff, and then I'll leave Adam, unfortunately, with the defensive stuff because it was your birthday. So I'll let you do the positive stuff. But we saw what this Norwich team is about at its best in terms of some of those attacking combinations, let alone the goals they scored, but also the chances they created. Josh Sargent hit the post, McConville hit the bar. There was plenty to like in that attacking performance, and probably the best of Norwich City in that aspect.
Yeah, I think it does come down to mainly individual performances. You know, like Paddy said, I don't think we learned too much about tactically how good they are or how well they work as a team against a team that was already relegated going into it and had 10 men for about 80 or 85 minutes of the game. But I thought on an individual level, obviously, once you get into those positions, you need that quality in the final third. And I think, for a few players, they had big games at important times. I think, obviously, Marcelino Nunez with a couple of goals. I'm not sure quite how the first one went in, but the second one was certainly, it was trademark, but it was out of the top drawer and a fantastic finish. I think Amankwa Forson is probably the one who everyone is talking about after that really, really good performance. Sainz, I think, to get back on the score sheet, which has been rare over sort of the second half of the season, was important for him on an individual level. The only thing really missing was Josh Sargent getting on the score sheet again. But yeah, I think once they got into those areas, they did produce the qualities. Probably in terms of actual clear-cut chances and shooting, they could have done better. But I think it's actually harder to produce the quality with the assist or the pass before the shot, and that's actually where a lot of the fine margins have been going against Norwich this season. So I think they got a lot of that right. They probably could have scored 6 or 7, but I thought on an individual level there were, particularly for the ones who you probably would have liked to see more from. I thought it was an improved performance, and yeah, particularly Forson, I would highlight in that sense. I thought it was really, really good.
Yeah, he was excellent. We'll come on to him a little bit later. But Adam, the defensive side, look, we're not reinventing the wheel. This is not cutting edge analysis really from a Norwich City perspective. It's been the case all season long. Another 2 goals conceded at home, 2 soft goals as well. You have to say, obviously the penalty and what was it, almost the third phase of a set piece. But for me, it was in the second half just how easy they were to transition on and how easily Cardiff got up the pitch. And look, Jack Wilshere said it post-match. We will come on to him, and whether it's him or anyone else next season, it's pretty clear to see where this Norwich City group needs to improve if it wants to progress.
Yeah, definitely. As much as the attacking sense, all the positives in that, you contrast that to the other end of the pitch, and it's been the root of the problem all season, as you outlined. That's kind of why they are finishing 13th and not in and around the top 6. Because if you purely take it from an attacking perspective, they're one of the better sides in the division in that department. And with Josh Sargent and Borja Sainz's quality and the goals they've scored, it's disappointing really that Norwich are ending the season in the manner they are. But it's quite contrasting, really. You go back to last week, and it was almost that battling, people throwing bodies on the line, and defensively they looked a lot more, structurally a lot better. Didn't really give Borough anything, to be honest. Nothing really that clear cut. They had a few opportunities, sort of particularly in the second half. But in terms of an away performance, it was perfect. To then go to that today against 10 men, and just all over the place at times. And I know you've got McConville playing slightly out of position at right back, and McLean obviously filling in at left back. And clearly, Doyle's had his injury issues over recent weeks, and only sort of just come back to full fitness. So you can sort of mitigate a little bit for some of those factors, but overall it's been an issue throughout the season. It's nothing new, and it's pretty clear to me that if Norwich are going to be in a position next season, irrespective of who's in the dugout and what players are here and who's not, that defence has got to be a priority over the course of the summer. Clearly, obviously, they're going to need 1 or 2 goalkeepers, but I think particularly that centre back position is kind of looking or calling my name. I think in terms of an area they've got to sort out. Obviously, left back, you've got Mahovo and Krizane to come back in, and right back Fisher and Stacey. If Stacey decides to stick around, we'll clearly have competition. But yeah, that centre of the park with Daw, heading back, and Duffy's future probably still a little bit up for debate. It's pretty clear that they've got to get it right if they're going to be in a position to try and compete next season.
Yeah, which I think is going to be a regular theme when we kind of talk about the summer in terms of getting more of those decisions right than maybe they have over the last couple of years. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because some of those names you mentioned individually, I think we would think of in the round. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than this, but Callum Doyle, I think you would say has had an okay season. I think he started really well and maybe faded off a little bit in the second half of the season, but I think most Norwich City fans would be pretty happy with or content with what he's produced this season. Obviously it varies and there's a spectrum of what different people think, but I think if you were to poll people, that's what they would say. Shane Duffy, I thought, again, had a really good start to the year and faded. Cordoba maybe has shown in bits and bobs, but as a collective, and this isn't just the defence, it always gets narrowed down to the back four, but it's wider. They just haven't done enough to be harder to play against in the main. So those kind of Middlesbrough-esque performances out of possession haven't been really seen that much. Maybe look at Watford away, Luton away, etc. We've just not seen enough of them, and that ultimately is probably what's cost them this season. Paddy, let's go to head coach then. Norwich don't have one. Clearly the man at the moment is Jack Wilshere in interim charge. He's had his 2-game audition. Where do you feel we are with that? Do you still think it's his to lose?
Well, we felt that all along, didn't we, Connor? But so nothing today materially should change that perception. Clearly it's Ben Napper's call now. In terms of the man himself, clearly we followed up with the pre-match sort of lines of inquiry with where does it stand now, and I mean, without him sort of saying he expects to be Norwich's full-time successor to Yannis Torup, your sense was that I think he, as he said himself, he couldn't have done any more in this 2-game window. The players, anecdotally, we've heard it pre-match, we've heard it again post-match today. They loved working with him, so those relationships that he'd started to foster from when he first came in the building, he's developed those when he's slightly shifted his focus from first team coach to interim. He clearly wants it. He reiterated that after today's game. I mean, he basically said when he was asked about what's the process looking like from now, do you have to have a formal interview? He said he honestly didn't know what the next few days held. I mean, he mapped out that they're off Sunday as a collective. They come back in Monday, Tuesday with the players. They'll debrief, send them away for the summer with things they need to work on. And then he more or less intimated that after that point, so midweek onwards, he felt this would accelerate, which chimes with what we were getting told before the game, really. So, you know, I mean, you made a good point after the game. You know, the complete absence, really, barring the initial and inevitable sort of link to Russell Martin when the first news of the Johannes' dismissal came through. It's been so quiet as to suggest that it doesn't feel there's a momentum behind any other alternative to Jack Wilshere. So, and as much as people rightly said, well, you clearly can't just base it on 2 games, but they were the most visible representations of what a Jack Wilshere Norwich would look like, and 4 points from 6, and an uptick in terms of the intangibles, the heart and the passion, the commitment, the desire. Less so maybe today. Certainly that was in evidence against Middlesbrough, and I would agree with him. Is there much more he could have done in this window? And I think the telling thing for me, and it came out of Johannes' media that he's done in Denmark in the last few days, because Jack's reiterated it again today, that Norwich have brought Jack Wilshere to Norwich, yes, initially as a first-team coach, but because they see in him a head coach of the future. He himself said, Jack Wilshere, that when he sat down with Hoff, as he called him, and Ben initially to thrash out what this could look like, he reiterated he wants to be a head coach. So if that process meant Jack Wilshere came in, the only thing that's changed really is the timeline, because I'm sure Jack Wilshere referenced it again today. Would he have thought 10, 11 months into this process he would be faced with a potential opportunity to be a head coach of Norwich? No, clearly not. Nobody envisaged that really. But those are the cards that are now in play, and he is certainly of the opinion he can do the job. He's shown he can do the job in a small sample, albeit, and he's willing and able, in his view, to if Ben Napper gives him that opportunity to take it up. And it was interesting as well, more broadly, his press conference. There was a lot of chat about what needs to happen in the summer window, what this squad needs, and the way he was talking. I'm not for a minute suggesting that he already believes he's got the job, but he was talking in the view of somebody who's going to be here and can shape that and have his input into it as a head coach. So pull all the strands together. Would we be surprised if the back end of this week Jack Wilshere is confirmed as Norwich's permanent head coach? I don't think we would. And then obviously it will then move on to, you hope, continuing the positive elements of what we've seen at this stage, going into a summer window, which is massive, and then obviously the start of the Championship season. And the debate will rage then about, is he too inexperienced? Is it another gamble, given that the Johannes one hasn't worked? And I guess we're in the realms of hindsight, and which isn't something Ben Napper can call on at this stage. And hypotheticals. Nobody can tell if Jack Wilshere is Norwich's head coach. That is going to work out any more than we could have said with Johannes. So, but my sense is that, I think internally, what they were looking for from Jack Wilshere in these 2 games, he's probably delivered. And if that is the case, and as I say, the backstop to this was that he came to this club to be a head coach at some point in the future, then, if that was how you felt when you brought him in October, what will have changed in a negative sense not to offer him the post? Now there is a post available.
Yeah, and I'm sure in many ways, even though we've obviously seen the very public shop window of Saturdays, I'm sure probably what has been more on Ben Napper's focus is how has he led those meetings, how has he communicated with players, how has he trained, how has he prepared, what's the schedule looked like, and all of those sort of details that go into preparation, and whether that's something over a 46 game block is perhaps something a little bit more sustainable than just what we saw. But equally, of course, you do need to, if Norwich would have got thumped 4-0 in both of these games, it would have been very difficult from an optics perspective to then hand him the job off the back of that. And so even though it's kind of felt like a 2-game window, Sam, I think it's fair to say that it hasn't been. And you would like to think, irrespective of what the results have been, if they believe that Jack Wilshere is the right man for this job, that he gets that because of other factors, not simply because he's managed to get 4 points from a possible 6 out of 2 championship games at the end of the season, where there's not a huge amount to play for from a Norwich perspective.
Well, you said optics, and I think that's basically the main benefit of them doing pretty well in these last 2 games. I mean, obviously, if they lose both of them 5-0 and, Wilshere ends up starting Shane Duffy up front and Jack Stacey's at centre-back and Angus Gunn gets a run out in midfield, then there are probably signs there that you might not want to give him the job permanently. But I think as long as it wasn't an absolute disaster like that, I agree with you that the large majority of the decision would have been based on Napa seeing Wilshere coaching, the setting up of training sessions, how he communicates with the players, how he gets on with the players, the conversations that those two themselves have had, and how they see football together. So yeah, I think in a way it was almost more difficult. I think we could have looked at the sort of the timing of the sacking of Torup and said it's a positive in terms of Wilshere, because you get to see the fact that he can manage, and you can see him in that role, and Napa gets to sample that a little bit. But in another way, it was a bit of a risk, because even if at that point, and obviously I'm not inside Ben Napa's head, so I don't know if that decision was made in his head at that point, but let's say that he did know enough about Wilshere that he would have given him the head coach job, and he just lets Torup stay on until the end of the season, then there's nothing for people to beat him over the head with, as there could have been if these 2 games had gone pretty badly. So in a way it was a risk, but I think it's paid off, because if Napa does want to go in that direction, and he does see these things behind the scenes that most of us don't see, he can now actually say to fans, well, you've seen him, his team produce a pretty decent performance away at Middlesbrough. They've got the job done, pretty comfortably against Cardiff when they would be expected to. So you can't really complain about those 2 games, and you can see maybe why he does look all right as a head coach. So I think, yeah, I agree completely that the decision, if it does end up being Wilshere, will be based on 90% the rest of those things. But certainly in terms of how it would be received and how people would react to that news, I think these 2 games have done them a huge favour, really. Well, I say favour, they've obviously put the work in to get those results, but I think they've worked massively in their advantage.
Certainly felt like the sun was shining on it, didn't it? Because 12 minutes into that game, Norwich had a really slow start. Angus Gunn had made, I think, 3 pretty good saves, and they weren't really in a contest. And then they score a goal, and there's a red card about 2 minutes later, and blink, and they're 3-0 up. It doesn't half help his cause. Adam, in terms of him, I mean, what have you made of him? Does he kind of feel like a head coach? Because I think there is a feeling that, certainly from his perspective, if it's not going to be Norwich, it's certainly going to be somewhere else, and it's certainly going to be probably in the not so distant future, right?
Yeah, you think so. Obviously, we've sort of closely observed him in press conference settings now for 4 occasions in terms of pre and post match, and obviously he's had a background in football, so clearly media trained. He's had it throughout his whole career, and obviously sort of even on sort of external media, you see him on TalkSport every now and again and other sort of platforms. So clearly, that's a sort of area he's pretty comfortable in, and yeah, he just gives me that kind of vibe. Pretty switched on, pretty intelligent, pretty clever, knows what he wants, very driven. The hunger's clearly there to prove people that he is a head coach and can do it at this level. He's pretty clear that, and reiterated really, that he thinks he's ready for this level. It's tough to say because his previous experience prior to arriving at Norwich has only ever been in youth development at under 18s level. But you look at some of the players he was coaching at that level, the likes of Wanyeri and Lewis Skelly, who are going on to do okay, I suppose, for the Arsenal setup. You kind of look at that and the fact that Norwich went down a route last summer that was very driven and pivoted towards trying to develop young players, which I think has probably been one of the areas that Torup was kind of dismissed on, the fact that some of the younger talents hadn't really progressed their claims from over the course of the season. You can make arguments maybe for the likes of Mahova or Kellen Fisher, but I think aside from that, has Svartal developed to the level I think I'd have hoped he has, given that the flashes we saw early on? Probably not. Even Forson, you look at the performance today, why was that not a player that Johannes could extract more from over the course of a 12-month period? So clearly that's an area that I think he's got a strong track record in. I do feel that if they do go with him, that there needs to be some experience in behind him. Obviously, clearly Tony Roberts' experience as a goalkeeping coach, Nick Stanley had a period in the game, but I think as a number two, they need someone who's worked in English football. If the Championship's on their CV, then great, but just someone with that little bit more nous, because clearly when you get into 3-game weeks in November and maybe that kind of novelty of Jack Wilshere being at the wheel has worn off a little bit, I think you need someone to lean on a bit, and what you don't want is another maybe young coach alongside him who's not got that experience, because I think that's maybe where the difficulties will come. So yeah, it's an exciting month or so ahead to see what if it is going to be Jack. But I think you look at kind of the suppose fan reaction post game today, and the chants towards him, and sort of him wandering around the pitch. He looks like someone who's ready for it. So fingers crossed if they do go down that way, that we're going to see a little bit more of what we saw at Borough and today. Maybe a little bit more improvement though in the defensive side.
Yeah, and I think what you are going to get, clearly, I know much is made about the inexperience point. I think generally experience in coaches is a little bit overstated. Clearly it's a quality, but I'm not sure it's as important as people make it out to be. It certainly wasn't important for Daniel Farker in his first year. It wasn't important for Alex Neil. Paul Lambert hadn't managed a Championship game before he took Norwich City up. They're just 3 examples. Obviously, there are others elsewhere in the game. So I can think it can get a little bit overstated. If you're a good coach and you can coach in a good way, and there's a balance, as we said, between what you can do tactically and how you manage a group of young men as well. If you can do that effectively, you'll be a success, whether you're 33 or 75. So I think less so. But I do think you make a valid point in terms of what the team in and around him needs to look like. And I bring Paddy in on this point because I think it does feel, Pad, and we'll come on to Johannes' media and what he spoke about in Denmark earlier this week. But one of the things that he spoke about was maybe how he kind of wished in hindsight he'd have brought a few more of his people in, people he'd worked with before. You look at that backroom staff that he had. Glenn Riddisholm hadn't worked with him before. Jack Wilshere clearly hadn't worked with him before. Nick Stanley, Tony Roberts never worked with any of those guys before.
Pete the Kitman,
legend, but hadn't worked with him before. It feels like he would need, and again, maybe this is too easy to say because he's a young man, he's a young coach, he needs experience behind him, but it probably does feel like that assistant role, if that was the way you want to go around it, or first team coach, does feel like that appointment would be as big probably as him stepping into that role.
Oh, no, I mean, without a shadow of a doubt, and he would need the person who we're talking about in terms of number two to have been, for me, somebody who's worked with directly in terms of his coaching journey or knows.
Coaching or playing, do you think he could work with them as a player?
As in...
So if he was a player and they were a coach, is that sort of a relationship that you think would be transferable to him being a coach? So
a former coach. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Basically somebody who he has intimately shared his footballing journey with, because we made that point. I can't remember, and I'm not claiming credit for that, but one of those recent podcasts, we did say that part of Johannes' downfall was, for me, because essentially what he was trying to do, it was a twin track process, and the fact that he's dispensed with would tell you that he wasn't successful in that it came in with a very clearly defined but quite a challenging footballing philosophy, and the players had to, the ones who were already here and then the ones he brought in, they almost had to have a crash course in what he was asking them to do. But equally, those coaches, which he had to assemble, as you say, from a standing start, even Glenn, a fellow Dane, but not somebody he'd worked with, knew of on the coaching circuit. But so I think that was a major issue, and clearly he's identified that himself in those interviews he's given in Denmark in the last few days. So to bring it back to potentially a Wiltshire head coach appointment, yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I think experience per se is a little bit overplayed, but what it needs to be is a strong relationship with somebody he already knows, who ideally has been around the circuit, ideally knows what the Championship's about. If not the Championship, then certainly top end of British football. And that without overstating it would be absolutely an imperative move, because if not, you feel like there's a sense or a danger the club repeat the mistakes of the very recent past.
Yeah, and Sam, one thing clearly he's very good at, because you've sensed it since he's been in the building, to be fair, as a first team coach, is that ability to build relationships. And I think there is clearly his background, his age probably helps him connect with a lot of those young guys, maybe slightly easier than others, and equally his playing background as well. Because if you're a young player, who wouldn't want to listen to him and extract any sort of insight that he had? If I was a Jacob Wright, you'd be knocking on his door every day trying to get some insight of how to get better and whatnot. But and we've seen it with other top English players. We can think of some. I'm thinking of one in particular, but I'm not going to name them. But there are others who they walk in and maybe they haven't been successful because initially there is that, oh goodness me, it's Jack Wilshere. Yeah. But you get into October and they've had 15, 20 games and suddenly they are just the head coach. They are the person that leads you. So it's all very well and good him cultivating those relationships over the last 2 games, but actually that fact he's got evidence of doing it over a 6-7 month period, albeit in a very slightly different role, that's going to go for him as well, you'd think.
Yeah, and I think you do see already a lot of people, saying it's all about the name, and I'm sure Ben Napper would argue vociferously against that idea. And I do think, I agree with both of you that experience, it can be very highly overrated at times, and talent in that area and ability is by far the most important component. But I think when you look at that camaraderie that I think can be so important, I think was really, really important for David Wagner to almost create that siege mentality when I think there was a lot of criticism, I would say fairly at the time, but there was a lot of criticism, and they almost used that to create something and to help them get into the playoffs last season. I think having been a player in that circumstance really does help you, and unfortunately for Torup, he just didn't have that element. And I'm sure if he could have made himself a better footballer and played at the level that Jack Wilshere did, then he would have done. But he wasn't, and he wasn't in those dressing rooms. He was a coach from a young age. He wasn't cultivating that atmosphere that Wilshere understands and knows exactly what it is. And there's one common theme from when Wilshere's arrived all the way up till now. It's that you keep hearing that players love him and they love working with him, and ultimately it obviously shouldn't just be based on that. It shouldn't be, if you like the coach then you're a better player, and that isn't how it works. But just having that extra element on your side, I think in modern football, and I'm a fan of tactics and XG and all of those things, but I think sometimes you can lose the fact that coaching isn't just about tactics. And I'm not knocking Wilshere's tactical ability at all, but I think we can lose sight of the fact
a blend,
that,
isn't it? You need a blend.
Yeah, and footballers are people just in the same way that they were 20 years ago. They need to be motivated just as much as the Arsenal players in 2011 needed to be motivated, and Wilshere obviously has a better understanding of what those players are like, how they're feeling, what the atmosphere is like in that dressing room when the coach leaves the room, and they're probably talking about what the coach has just said, and how they're reacting to things among themselves. So I think it is an advantage for him, and even if you say he's inexperienced, he does have that element on his side, and the things you hear out of the club about how the players are reacting to him tells you that.
Yeah, and we hear it as well, right? I spoke to Angus Gunn, albeit these are 2 players that are leaving, but Angus Gunn said it, Callum Doyle said it. You can see the podcast in full later in the week. We spoke to Jack Stacey and Onel Hernandez, both of them said it as well. There's a real love for him and to work for him as well. And you hear about some of the changes and music playing in warm-ups and stuff, and that is something that he has been able to do, cultivate a real spirit in that group over the last 10 days or so. But I know people look at that and being that such a short period that anyone could do it, but it seems like that backdates even as a coach. You kind of heard pretty readily they love Jack, he's popular. These are pretty common sentiments you've heard.
Yeah, I think you kind of get that vibe off him. He's clearly a pretty energetic, happy character, and someone that I'd imagine you'd bounce off if you're in the same room as him. Even in the media, I think you can see he's kind of got that cheekiness about him and that edge that I think a lot of people will warm towards. And if you're a player, obviously as you outlined, clearly the name, but you kind of escape that a little bit because he's clearly someone that the players want to play for, want to work with, and he's also worked under some of the best coaches in the game. Look at Arsene Wenger and what he managed to achieve at Arsenal, irrespective of the way it ended. Clearly a top level elite coach. Arteta, the fact he's worked closely with him, and you can look at kind of obviously a completely different level, but so he'd probably take a little bits of what he's maybe done at Arsenal and completely changed the culture of that place. And you look at Arsenal maybe 10 years ago, where they are now, it's completely different. And a lot of younger players that have developed as well. So yeah, I think overall, he's the kind of character that I think I would be happy working alongside. So if I get that vibe, and from the outside, if you're a player within it, who is at Colney every single day, and you're motivated to play for someone, then that's only going to end well, you'd think, rather than maybe the opposite end of the spectrum where it's maybe someone that you don't kind of get that feeling off, and you're not going to put 100% in all the time, and maybe that sort of body on the line at different moments and throwing yourself into tackles and stuff, that you kind of get that extra buzz and energy if it's somebody that you want to impress, I suppose, on the sideline.
Yeah, and to chuck in two more names to the list that you mentioned, clearly played under Eddie Howe as well at Bournemouth, David Moyes at West Ham. So it's not a bad list that he's got behind him, in terms of experience coaching, and I think what he's got as opposed to some of the other kind of bigger former England generational kind of stars that we maybe look at is his pathway's been good. It's been considered. It's been academy, then into first team coaching. I mean, I wrote a piece about this in the week. It is essentially identical to the way Scott Parker went about it. He started off as Tottenham's under 18s. Wilshere was actually an under 18 coach for longer than Parker was. Parker then went into first team at Fulham. I think he was assistant under Jukanovic and Ranieri, and then took the main job. And it's worked out okay for him. I think he's just secured his third promotion. That's not to say Wilshere will go on to do that, but as a coaching pathway, it's a little bit more considered than some who have just jumped in with 2 feet into management. And I know Wayne Rooney didn't really have a choice at Derby because of the circumstances they were in, but there have been others who maybe have done that and have struggled a little bit as well. And I mean, Paddy, just to kind of wrap this up, really, I guess is there any world in which it's not Jack Wilshere and that someone else emerges to the front of?
Got me mixed up with another individual called Ben Napper, I think.
But do you see there being another world in which it's anyone other than Jack Wilshere, based on what we've seen? Clearly, this him as you said, unless we started this discussion, we're going full circle really. But he wants the job. He's there. Yeah. He fits the kind of profile of coach that we know Ben Napper likes. There's a lot going for him in this conversation.
Well, to me, I mean, it wouldn't stack up if, and what we haven't talked about is the relationship between those two individuals goes back to those Arsenal days. They know each other, as Jack said on Friday.
And there are optics around that as well, aren't there? Because there will be people, and and you've seen it. It's Napper's mate, and we saw it previously with Stuart Webber and David Wagner. That was a criticism that was levelled there, and sometimes that can be a strength as much as it can be a weakness, particularly in the sporting director coach model. Yeah,
and I've no doubt whatsoever Ben Napper will be aware of that, and maybe can use this period, if that is the decision, to just reaffirm that, he has shown himself, albeit in a small sample, that allied to the stuff we've already talked about, away from the pitch, the shop window, that, I believe him to be the right candidate if you're Ben Napper. But that, for me, is why I think it will end up this process, because otherwise, why has Ben gone and pursued Jack Wilshere, and without knowing it, because he hasn't really put it out there to the point of saying X club, Y club, but I am pretty sure in those 2.5 years he was at Arsenal, he would have had opportunities, he would have had conversations. He's talked around that in his last 2 weeks, didn't feel it was right, felt he still had to learn a little bit before he was ready to take the leap. And at the time Norwich came along, he felt that was the right time. So you don't, as he said, to repeat what I said earlier, what he said after the game today, you come to Norwich, you say, I want to be a head coach. This is the pathway I want to embark on. You've drawn a parallel with Scott Parker. He said before the Middlesbrough game, he looked at various pathways, how he goes from academy coach to the next stage, the next link in the chain to ultimately being a head coach. He saw Norwich as the best pathway for him. He reiterated again today. He still firmly believes, and that's one of the reasons he came here, the strategy chimes with what he sees he could offer to that type of role. The strategy isn't changing. We know that. The head coach has clearly changed, but the strategy remains absolutely the same that enticed him to Carrow Road in the first place, to work with a Ben Napper who he knows going back to their Arsenal days. There's a mutual trust there, a mutual respect. So it would now seem a little bit at odds with that if Ben Napper then pivots. And to go back to my earlier point, pivots where, because there's no other names that I'm aware of that are in the frame that are anything more than speculative, and there's not even a lot of that, and that's quite telling, I think. There's not even huge amounts of kite flying going on beyond, as I say, that initial flurry about Russell Martin maybe, and a little bit of Tom Cleverley, which was clearly wide of the mark on both examples. So in the absence of any other sense that there's any other plates moving or shifting here, then yeah, I would be surprised now if it doesn't end this path in Jack Wilshere, Norwich's permanent head coach.
Yep, I agree. One thing I was disappointed today, and we've got a picture of it on one of these papers that's in front of us here. He's ditched that cardigan, which was I like that. He's certainly got I'm sure it's horrendously expensive, but he's got the modern head coach cardigans, hasn't he?
I was pro jacket actually. I like the jacket more than the cardigan, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it's fair enough.
Well, I've seen a lot more love for the cardigan than the jacket, so maybe
It's a bit Arsene Wenger. He used to like a cardigan, didn't he, Arsene?
Yeah, he did actually.
He did, yeah.
That. Yeah.
I'm sure he'd like.
If he brings out the long coats.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure he based his dress sense on Arsene Wenger. Probably not.
I'm sure it was probably a hipster's dream, wasn't it? Him and Ramsey. He had Ramsey in kind of the long flowing trousers and the mullet, and Wilshere dressed as he was. But we're not a fashion podcast, and we certainly won't proclaim to be looking like this. So we'll leave it there for now. Part 2, we'll obviously talk farewells. We'll speak about what Torup's been saying in Denmark, and we're going to do a little season review. We're probably going to do a bigger podcast later down the line, really reflecting on it. But all I will say is I got the prediction nailed on for where they finish. See you in a minute. Welcome back to the PinkUn.com and Norwich City podcast, brought to you in association with First Bus, reflecting on Norwich City's championship curtain closer against Cardiff, 4-2 victory to end their campaign, a 13th place finish for Norwich City this season. Let's jump back in with obviously some farewells. Sam, today there were 3 senior players, obviously Archie Mayer and Jonathan Thompson. I recognise they've been a little bit forgotten in probably this week, but more frontline options: Angus Gunn, Onel Hernandez, Jakob Sorensen, all got the opportunity to say goodbye. Obviously, we spoke to Onel on Thursday with the live pod that we did, and you could sense, I think maybe with him, I certainly got the impression it hadn't quite sunk in yet. Yeah. We spoke to him post game as well, and I think he kind of said that he thought it would be tomorrow. But I think certainly for Angus it would have been an emotional day. Jakob Sorensen as well.
Yeah, and I mean after that many years as a player at the one club, especially given how rare it feels that is, I'm sure it was pretty emotional for them. And in a sense, it's a shame that they weren't able to leave things on a bit more of a high, or at least in a game that felt like it mattered a bit more. But I suppose there's also the fact that if there's one minor positive from Norwich having nothing to play for at this stage of the season, it's that Wilshere could chuck Vicente Reyes on with a couple of minutes left and let Angus Gunn have that clap off the pitch. Sorensen could have that stint at right back, although that is what Wilshere did at Middlesbrough as well. So maybe he fancied him as a right back.
There was something quite nice about Jakob Sorensen ending his Norwich career out of position in a role that probably doesn't really suit him. Yeah,
it was one injury away from summing up his spell at the club, but no, it was I think it was good that he got to play that many minutes, and obviously Onel as well in that role, and probably I would say Hernandez took the large majority of the adoration, as probably could be expected. Maybe also because it felt the most. I mean, I don't think there were too many saying that Sorensen should have stayed at the club, but I think when you consider the fact that him and Gunn were probably the two main sort of emotional pools, and the Gunn one was divided in opinion a lot. Obviously, you spoke to him after the game, and it wasn't quite as clean cut. This is the right time. It didn't feel that I don't know, that much of a straightforward story as maybe it did with Hernandez. So I think there was maybe a slightly more of an element of closure with Hernandez, but ultimately I think the fact that at least those players got that send off was a positive from today. When you consider, and I know Gunn actually referenced that when he spoke to you. When you consider last year and the fact that because they were going for the playoffs, I don't think those players actually ever really got a proper send off. The closest they would have got would have been those, sort of waves to the fans. First of all, after you've lost 4-0 to Leeds in the playoff semi-final, and secondly, I think that was before the announcement, wasn't it, about who would be staying and leaving. So they never really got that. I think it's good that those players really got that. Especially when you think it's it's two title winners, one multi-title winner at the club, and the other one is the son of Brian Gunn, who's been first choice goalkeeper for several years, one of Norwich's most consistent and best performers in a difficult period for the club. And yeah, I thought they mostly got the send off they deserved, although I'm sure they would rather it had been in a slightly more important game.
Yeah, I mean, Adam, on Onel, I think, look, we could have a debate about the time of it and maybe his contribution over the last couple of years, and whether he's been quite the same player that kind of exploded onto the scene in that 2018-19 campaign. And they are debates that have been well had, and we've had them on this podcast, and fans have had them amongst themselves. But as Sam said, you've got a guy there who won 2 championship titles, remarkable story. Was playing second tier in Germany, didn't speak English. I'm not sure, I haven't confirmed this with him, but I don't know if he'd ever been to England before. Clearly, he told the story to us on Thursday night about his sort of journey from Cuba to Germany as a 4-year-old, I think it was, to then go and play in the Premier League and be the first Cuban to do that, make 200 appearances. But I think it's very hard not to look at Onel as a human being. So much is made, particularly of modern footballers, some of which, accusations thrown around that maybe there isn't that same connection with the club they're at. It's all quite transactional at points. I mean, there is a man who has embraced himself in every facet, and today I think every stand of Carrow Road, and he's got the badge on his arm. He is somebody that has embraced Norwich City and everything that is given him. And I think, irrespective of the footballing side, as a human being, it's hard, and been hard probably over the last 7 years, not to look at him and really root for him.
Yeah, definitely. I think he's probably one of the only players to ever really allow fans in sort of behind the scenes with obviously his vlogging and various social media platforms, which again, sometimes ended him hot water for him in terms of, being plunged out of the squad and various other things. But I think there was always kind of a positive meaning behind it. It was never there to try and, suppose disgruntle or hurt fans. It was very much, look, here's all the good stuff behind the scenes at Colney. Here's, the players doing this, and this is how we get on, and all these various things. So yeah, but I think he's obviously clearly came to Norwich, and it's changed his life. Quite frankly, he's ended up meeting his partner. He's had children here, and he's lived here for a long period of time, and made Norfolk his home for a long period. And clearly, anybody who looks around kind of previous players, and a lot of them that end up settling here, I think that there's clearly a pull to this city and the fans, and he's one that's embraced that to the absolute max. And you see it sort of after games. If you ever walk behind the South Stand about 2 hours after the game, he's still out there speaking to the fans and taking pictures and handing out shirts. And it is rare, because you kind of go to the top of English football, and certainly even in the Championship, I wouldn't imagine there's a lot of footballers out there at half these other clubs that go to the levels that he does, even sending social media videos to people on their birthdays and whatever it might be. He's almost, not what you would call a stereotypical footballer. He's a human being who wants to connect with people, wants to make people happy. And he's just someone who loves the club. And I would be shocked if there's a world where he's not back in the stands at some point in the future, whether that's still coming back here to live or certainly just visiting on a regular occurrence. He's obviously got the badge tattooed on him as well, which, is probably a rarity as well in football. I can't imagine there's too many footballers that have got a club badge tattooed to them. So, obviously there's the stuff on the pitch, but there's also the stuff off the pitch. I think every Norwich fan, irrespective of their view on him as a footballer, will wish him all the best in the future, and hopefully he goes and find a home somewhere else and kicks on. But I think he'll always come back to Norwich, because like a lot of them, he's got a lot of love for this club, these people, and the fans.
Yeah, with him and Angus, and I put this to Angus post game, it feels like a more see you soon rather than completely goodbye. I think for both of those. I mean, we saw Onel post game and kind of said to me, we'll see you in a few years anyway. So it definitely feels like he is going to be back here in some capacity and involved, because you can sense that he clearly, and we spoke to him again on Thursday, and he spoke about that connection he's established with his club. He's not had that anywhere else he's been, and it's special when that happens. I think, irrespective maybe of whether the last few years have panned out exactly how everyone would have hoped, or whether or not he's made the contributions that he would like. I think he's made I think there was a mad stat that he's made the most appearances for Norwich as a substitute or something like that, which is it's a stat that kind of, I guess, sort of backs up what he is as a human being as well. Someone who isn't eagerly pushed himself or driven about himself. He's been someone very focused on the club. So yeah, I'm sure everyone of a yellow and green persuasion, even if you weren't the biggest fan of Onel Hernandez, the footballer, I'm sure as the person, there'll be plenty of people wishing him well. Paddy Angus, we've got to speak about what he said post game, because there was a very interesting. It was a line to Chris Gorham, but he sort of repeated it to me later on as well about the manner of how this year's unfolded for him, really. And he's out of contract. That's been well documented. I think we said on a few occasions that kind of our sort of understanding of that there hadn't been any sort of real concrete talks, which he said, and sort of said that he learnt of his release in a 2-minute conversation with Ben Napper last week. That's clearly been sort of taken by fans. What's your view on that and around that? Obviously, it's only his side of the story, and I'm sure Ben Napper would present a very different case. I'm sure in the future he'll get an opportunity to present that side of the case to the story. But certainly, if you take that at face value, it doesn't feel the best to me. That
no, it's not the right way to treat a player who's, well, given what he's given in terms of service, but then wrap around the fact that he's a Norwich fan. He's come through at Norwich. This is his home. The family connection, which we don't need to talk about. We know it's there. That strong lineage. And but you're right. That's Angus's take on the situation, how it's mapped it out, and you would need to get the club's perspective from that, and we'd hope to get that in due course. But it does chime with kind of the sense that we'd had that certainly there'd been no indication from the club side to either Angus or his representatives at any point this season that there could be a world where he remained Norwich's keeper for with a new deal in his back pocket. So, but there's a right way to go about it, and that mutual respect that should be there, irrespective, but certainly with a player who's effectively a Norwich fan first and then a Norwich player second. And it would sense, having listened to the audio from Angus's interview with you and Chris, that I think it's, without putting words in his mouth, I'd imagine he doesn't feel that's been handled the right way, and he's probably quite upset about that, and maybe it leaves a little bit of a sour taste, and that's, I don't think there's any need for them to have parted on those terms, because it's his club. I couldn't see that being anything irreparable moving forward. Like you, I would expect him back at some point. I wouldn't even rule out a third senior spell as a footballer, because he's got many years ahead of him still if he stays clear of injury. If not a post sort of association with the club, you could see that, because he is yellow and green. So, yeah, as I say, from his side of the perspective of this equation, if that is how it has been communicated to him, and that there was no real indication, no even sense from Angus's side that there was a prospect of talks or even a willingness to have talks, then it seems a very strange way to go about it with somebody of his standing in the club and in the community more broadly. You saw the reaction, you saw the warmth and reaction towards him from those fan base. I'm sure these quotes, although they've only just aired in the last few hours since the final whistle, will not have gone down well with the fan base, because, as I say, mutual courtesy and respect, it should be the watchwords, really, when you're dealing with what is a very sensitive and difficult decisions in terms of Angus Gunn's future is now up in the air. He's got a young family. I think he said to you he's packing up boxes from Norwich and moving himself back to a base in the northwest. He faces an uncertain future, and that uncertainty could have been mitigated to a degree if Norwich had been, based on what he has said after the game today, a bit more forthcoming with their intentions towards him for next season. I think that's the least he deserved.
Yeah, and I think above all else, what is true isn't true. Whether there was talks with representatives, whether there wasn't, whether there were offers made, whether there wasn't, really is kind of irrelevant. And I think you hit the nail on the head there, Paddy. It's sad to think of the Gunn surname that is forever and will forever be connected with Norwich City. I think I don't know if it's true. I saw someone say that him and Brian are the first father and son duo to play and keep a clean sheet in the Premier League. If that's right. I mean, clearly there's Schmeichel's as well, so I don't know if that would be right. Maybe it isn't, but certainly one of the few, and clearly the connection that last name has with Norwich. Sam, it's a shame that he almost rides off into the sunset with that being the feeling, that there is a nagging doubt that maybe it wasn't handled correctly, or in his view he wasn't dealt with right. That's a shame. Look, he's not stupid. He said it himself. You know, as a footballer, if there hasn't been anything concrete by the new year, that the likelihood is you're going to leave. But I mean, if the case is that, you know, the first time it's been confirmed to him is a week before that's announced, I mean, that could have been done earlier, couldn't it? Really.
Well, yeah, I mean, clearly, because when we're talking about it already on our podcast, and, you know, obviously that's our job, but when it's already being talked about public, I think it was basically common knowledge 2-3 months ago, or maybe more. I mean, it was becoming more and more concrete in the public eye as well, not just behind the scenes. That everyone knew it was very likely that he was going to go. You know, we were getting asked questions about who was going to be the new goalkeeper a few months ago, and he's there. For all the reasons you mentioned, somebody who's so closely linked to the club and who, you know, the club means so much to him. That yeah, it is very sad when he probably knew all that was going on, and if he hasn't had that clarity, there hasn't been that conversation. I mean, realistically, he should have known more. You know, before anybody knew in the public eye, he should have known about that. So yeah, I don't want to criticise too much until we do hear that other side of the story, and yeah, hopefully we do get to speak to Ben Napper soon, and you know, see what he has to, or hear what he has to say about that. But yeah, I don't think that is how you should be going about things, and I think part of the reason why fans are so upset by that is because they can identify with him. You know, the idea is he's a Norwich fan. You know, he's realistically what he's doing, or theoretically what he's doing, is living out that dream of somebody picks you out from the stand and puts you on the pitch. And obviously, you know, he's not lucky to be there. He's a very, very good goalkeeper. But I think fans see him and they go, the way he's feeling playing on that Carrow Road pitch must be how I would be feeling if I was there right now. You know, if I could live my dream, and I'm sure they're almost thinking about how they would feel if that was how they'd have to depart the club. And you spoke about the fact that it felt like more of a see you later than a goodbye. And in some ways, that's a good. I think that is, you know, largely a good thing. But I think it should have felt more final. It was a nice send off, but in a weird way, when he was walking off that pitch, it did. You weren't just thinking about all the glorious memories. And
yeah, it wasn't like it was with Wes, for example,
No,
or
exactly.
even maybe Temu Pukki.
No, it wasn't. There weren't the tears, and you know, although there was the ovation, and certainly he got that love from the fans, it felt a bit more mired in different things. You know, whether it's where he goes next, or whether it was the right decision to get rid of him. These, you know, the things that he then referenced to you afterwards, and it didn't have. Although a lack of finality in one sense is a nice thing, I think you want that moment to wrap it all up, and for him to really feel that warmth. And I didn't think there was as much of that as maybe there was with Hernandez. So yeah, it is a shame to end things in that way. And as I said, it will be interesting to hear Napper's take on it. But I suppose to try and look at it in a positive way, I'm sure in a few years' time, hopefully he'll look back on it and he'll say he represented the club that he grew up supporting, that he was arguably the best goalkeeper in the league at one point, playing in a Norwich City shirt. And yeah, hopefully in the fullness of time, everyone's able to recognise that, because I think his performances over the last 4 years have deserved that.
Yeah, and he's achieved a lot, hasn't he, Adam? When you think he came in the Premier League as a second choice to Tim Krul, that was no mean feat, kind of dethroning Tim Krul at that stage with how well he'd played at Norwich, the seasons that he had, the experience he had, the reputation he had, and he very gradually chipped away at him and managed to eventually get that. He's become a fully fledged international. He's achieved, and he said this post game, his dream of playing Premier League football with his boyhood club. I mean, it's pretty remarkable what he's achieved. Obviously, 172 games. Yep. I think he's ended on. I think he should be very proud of what he's achieved at Norwich City.
Yeah, I think, you know, goalkeeper is always a difficult position because there's only one slot on the team sheet. So, you know, you've got to be the one that gets the nod. So the fact he managed to give Tim Krul a good run for his money. And we all know, Tim Krul's legacy at this football club and what he managed to achieve over a couple of titles over, quite a number of years, and all the glorious moments in the Premier League. So the fact that he managed to get himself in there and then retain that shirt, particularly under David Wagner in that second half of the Championship season, the first time round, it's credit to him. And there's been some, high praise for him. Certainly last season, I think, there was big claims that he was the best keeper in the Championship, and he lived up to that at certain moments. There was some big saves in there that earned Norwich some vital points at different moments, and unbeaten against Ipswich, and some of the scenes at Portman Road when they beat them there when he was on loan the first time and sort of celebrating. I'd imagine for him personally that feeling must have been any Norwich fan knows that feeling. So the fact that he was on the pitch in front of that, I think the lower Sir Bobby at that point, and celebrating there, that must have felt, something quite special for him. And just the legacy and the fact he's managed to keep that on. He had a son quite recently, so maybe there is another story there, and a third gun to step in the Norwich net. But I think he'll look back at this and probably a little bit of sadness. Maybe he wasn't able to achieve a promotion and maybe replicate the some of the success that his father had at the club. But who knows, that chapter might not be completely closed yet, and there might be an opportunity at some point in the future that he does step back and achieves that. But the international recognition, and some of the big saves. I think he'll look back with sort of pride that he managed to represent his football club with top servant really, and a top guy.
Absolutely. He did say about his newly born son, he's only a couple of weeks old, and he said he's going to try and make sure that he's an outfielder because there's more finance in that, was the exact quote. So, and of course he's got a daughter as well. There's a women's team. I'm sure it's not the last we've heard of the Gun name and Norwich City in the years ahead. I think basically since the 80s there's been a Gun in some sort of position, be it playing or managing, in every decade, which is a remarkable statistic. Paddy, let's look. You tell me if this is a far-fetched link, because I might get accused of it being so. But it's been a week where obviously Johannes has done some media in Denmark. He's spoken a lot around communication and expectations, and maybe presented, and you could read into what he said, and people can read into it differently. But certainly felt like he wasn't particularly aligned towards the end of his tenure. You've obviously now got Angus coming out, and there will be fans, I think, looking at this and maybe questioning the communication aspects. The alignment, I guess, of various aspects as well. So that point firstly, but secondly on Johannes' sort of media in Denmark, what were your views on it? What did you make of it? It was interesting to read it come out so soon, I guess, as well.
Yeah, but I'm sure he needs to, because there was a part 2, I think, with the same organisation, which was very much about, the phone's already ringing off the hook. He's got a 5-day holiday. He's promised Mrs. Torop in south of France, and if reneges on that, he could be heading to the divorce court. So I think it was a lot of positioning himself for what comes next, and inevitably, before you get to that point, you have to maybe dissect, in his view, what went wrong. Not surprised, because that was effectively the indication from a touch point we'd had with him post his dismissal, and it was more or less embellishing what the sense you got from that interaction, which was him and Glenn felt this top 6 barometer wasn't communicated to them as the weighting attached to that was to the significant tipping point that it would, when they were so far off that, which they were by the end, the deciding factor in dismissing him and Glenn. So, those questions around alignment will continue. You speak to anybody at the club and they would push back very hard on that narrative, which is how it's been portrayed from certain elements within the football club. That, of course, Johannes is going to come out and say that, because it almost then detaches him a little bit from what went wrong and the downward cycle of results and performances.
And he's pitching, right? Like you said, it's what comes next. He's
exactly,
got to try and explain what happened.
Yeah.
And, if you're reading it in those contexts, if you're a Danish club or whatever, maybe it doesn't look so bad. I don't know.
No, because, if you take that narrative as the one that you feel explains why did a very highly rated young coach leave Denmark to go to the Championship and then it ends so badly within 10 or 11 months, if the sense from their side that Glenn and Giannis's, is that the goalposts were moved at some point and defined within the season. Yeah, but as I say, that is very much rejected by anybody connected to Norwich who may have been in and around the decision. They would rightly, I think, because I don't think you can overlook the regressive trend in results, performances over a prolonged period, the sense that player improvement wasn't there, which was one of the key elements around his candidacy and why he was identified as a suitable replacement for this new era, new direction from pivoting away from David Wagner. So if he's not delivering on that brief, he's not delivering in terms of on-pitch performance, and of course you're going into a big summer window. Do you entrust him to have a serious input into what player looks like who comes to the club, and then results and performances don't improve the other side, and you're faced with a bit of a nightmare scenario there where the guy who has had quite a lot of input in terms of reshaping that squad over the summer is no longer in charge. So, they very clearly are of the opinion that, it wasn't, as maybe those comments in the Danish media suggest, that there was a gradual breakdown in communication between the people who mattered, and that this top 6 target was the one that he was measured by. They would push back on that quite hard. And I thought it was interesting if you look at Webber's column today, which of course was a forum that was highlighted for maybe where that view was amplified in the last period. The top 6 was a target that you could use to benchmark. She very much talks about everybody is very aligned, everybody's very clear on what the goals are, what the ambitions are for this club moving forward, and essentially that there hasn't been any deviation from that. So, as I say, Giannis is clearly of that view. Those inside the club would be of a different view. You pays your money, you takes your choice on that one. But for me, it's from various touch points with the Danish lads. There's no doubt that they felt plates did shift underneath them during this season. Whether that was the case or not, that's their sense. But that clearly doesn't, for me, excuse 3 wins in 14, 1 win in 10. The performance levels, the failure really to, in any seriously voluminous state, improve players beyond maybe Fisher, beyond maybe Mahovo before he got injured. Wright was showing signs that he was responding quite receptively. Dobbin as well before injury intervened, but that's too small a sample, I think, in terms of the people who are making these decisions at Norwich. So, yeah, whereas you take from the Giannis's interview sound bites that there was clear water between the parties, those still here at the football club making those decisions are not of that opinion. So they're not going to agree on that that very point, that very central fundamental point from Giannis's side of the equation, which was, you told me one thing at the start of the season, mid to long term projects, progress, yes, but not a benchmarking against top 6 this season. So, again, much like we were talking about earlier with next time we speak to Ben, and we'll talk to him about the Angus Gunn situation. We'll certainly be putting these comments to him as well, and be interested to hear what his reasoning is.
Yeah, I think both things can be true. I think it can be true that, and I think this, and you lads jump in if any of you disagree, but I felt it's been a little bit muddled in terms of what they've communicated from an objective standpoint, because we've sat in the forum last summer and we sat in several press conferences thereafter, and Torup did speak about the top 6, and he spoke about it being a possibility. There were other times where he spoke about it being if all the things lined up and all the situations worked, then it was a possibility, and that maybe cast a little bit more doubt on it. Then you kind of had people in the background speaking about transitions and projects and all of this kind of thing, and long-term thinking. So all of that can be true, and I think that is one point. The other point is they did lose 6 games in 10, and it's very difficult for any head coach at any level to survive that in the modern game. That's a fact. And as you say, the performances were getting worse. If Norwich City would have had 5 games left in the season as opposed to the 2 they had post Millwall, I think we'd have had a very real conversation about them getting dragged into a relegation scenario. So I think there probably is truth in both positions. look, if they were, let's say they were 8th and they were upwardly mobile and they just missed out, would we be talking about Johannes Hoftorp not being Norwich City's head coach? I don't think we would be, really. I think it's that trend since sort of February, March time where they've been bottom of the form table that's ultimately done it for him. But I can understand, and I wrote something on this about his position. I do have sympathy with his position in terms of he clearly felt, irrespective of how the season went, barring absolute disaster, he wasn't going to be judged on it, and clearly he has been. So, yeah, I can sympathise with both positions, and probably the truth is somewhere in the middle of those. Right, very quickly, because we are going to do a full end of season debrief, and that's probably likely to come once the head coach is confirmed, depending on how long that search is, because we're still waiting by mid-June, and I think we might have done it by then. But we are at some stage going to do a full sort of season debrief, so I don't want to. What we're going to do is give them a little bit of a cliffhanger, leave them wanting more. That's what you have to do, don't you, in the trade? So I'm going to get you. You can decide if you want to do it in a word or 3 words, preferably no more than a sentence. But I'll go around you to kind of sum up your views and feelings of the campaign. Sam, let's start with you. In a word, 3 words, or a sentence. You take either of those. What are your feelings of what 2024-25 has been for Norwich City?
I'm going to take the expansive whole sentence. In many ways, it's been exactly what we thought it was going to be, and in many ways, it's been the complete opposite. I mean, is that short enough?
Perfect. Yeah, leave them there. Adam, for you?
Roller coaster of highs and lows, more lows than highs.
Paddy, we'll end with you.
Unfulfilled promise.
Oh, deep.
Very, very philosophical. The fish follow the trawler.
Indeed, that seems like a nice place to leave it. I think we're going to have to over the summer and the weeks that come
Did you
ahead.
give us your one, Connor?
No, I didn't. What would I say about it? That's a good point. Yeah, I quite like yours. That's why I wanted to leave it on yours, to be honest. Yeah, I've got nothing more to add than what any of you said, really. So I'm going to cop out of this one. But yeah, I think all of your sentiments are correct. It's a shame that kind of what started as a new era has kind of ended in a bit of a similar position. Yeah. So yeah, maybe treading water or something like that we could go for. But I liked unfulfilled potential, so I'll lean into that. That is a nice place to end the pod. Thank you, gents, for today and for this season. Thank you to First Bus as well for their continued support. We haven't done just the ticket, but we are hoping to do a little bit of a special with them post-season as well. So keep your eye out for that. With as I said, when we do this post-season debrief, so we can do just the ticket for the season. Sorry to Josh Sargent for not mentioning his Player of the Season award, and to Kellen and for obviously young player, and Sue as well, who won supporter of the season. All of those guys, fantastic work. We will, thank you very much for watching all of the pods across this season. There'll be plenty more in the summer and beyond. PinkUn.com, of course, the place to go for all of the latest breaking news, analysis and reaction as well. I'm sure we'll see you at regular intervals during what we expect to be a very busy summer for Norwich City. Full steam ahead of 2025-26. See you soon.